Hello and welcome to this training session. My name is Ashraf Ayad and I'll be working with you today in one of Maya's new feature. It's called Scene Assembly. Please note that the functionality is available in the 2013 extension, also known as 2013.5. The name might be a little bit misleading. It's not an add-on to 2013, it's a full installer. One way to check is to go to the plugin manager and see that the Scene Assembly plugin is loaded. A quick note that this plugin needs GPU cache to be active as well. So once you activate the scene assembly, it automatically will load the GPU cache, which is under the pipeline cache. Before I get started, I should give thanks to both product designers, Robert Skina and Trevor Adams. I should also extend this to both QA and development, as they all helped creating this video. If you go to Autodesk website, you'll see they have a nice demo about scene assembly. And if you press play, the artist will show that they have a large city, such as Venice, where they can fly through the city without loss of data or Maya having any difficulty putting all this amount of information in one shot. You can zoom in at the city block and you can zoom in further to one of these table sets, and then the artist will show that he can change different representation according to his need. That can be very useful, of course, for the obvious reason with the amount of data that previously Maya could not handle in one shot. And also it will allow different artists access the same file at different levels of time. For example, if you have your modeler still working on that building, you can just put a box or a B box here as a holder. And if I'm the layout artist, all I need is that where is that building going to sit? And I just start putting all my assets here. Once the artist finish, I can flip to the final version of my scene. This is not to be confused with file reference. This is not file reference 2.0, for example. This is a different type of data management, and it also helps if you have an existing pipeline, as well. This will add as a complementary to an existing pipeline. At this point, you will have to either build it manually, which I'm going to show you how to do it step by step, which can also be easily scripted, but I will leave that to you to decide how you're going to implement it in your pipeline. The scene assembly functionality has two nodes. It can be accessed via the create pull-down menu, scene assembly, or from the outliner, or also from the viewport. If you have an object, you can right-click on it and activate the scene assembly functionalities. The first one we're going to look at is called the scene assembly definition, which is the first step of defining, well, that's hence the name definition, what kind of representation you want in that node. In general, we accept three types of representations: locator, GPU cache, and Maya scene file. That can be an MA or an MB. I just put a quick comparison for the frame speed. Of course, it goes without saying the locator will be the fastest, followed by the B-box, GPU cache, finally your actual Maya scene. When you create a scene assembly definition, if you open the option box, it adds a locator by default. You can disable that if you wish. And once you create one, you will get this prompt window that heads up that assembly definition should not have any type of edits in it. And when I mean by edits, as in your file, when you add it here, should be ready to go. And I will show you how to create a ready to go scene. But in general, you can add, as we said, a locator will be activated automatically. You can add any type of annotation here, for example, foo, and it will be added here. You can read what type of representation that just added to this locator. And then you have the option to add multiple cache files. So for example, if I'm be working with a car, I have my B-box cache. I can then add another type of cache, and so on and so forth. And then I can add a scene, for example, my car scene. So the first step is to actually get these files ready for assembly definition. And that's going to be the first thing we're going to do right now. Here I'm starting with one of my scene elements. One note, I moved the car to the 0, position, and I also froze transformation. I would use this as a best practice kind of approach, and I will show you why when we start assembling the definitions. But it will be important to make sure that all your elements will come in the same spot, rather than having one here and one move to a different location. That will make it hard for you when you're doing the assembly definition and moving between the representation to track where is the proper position of your elements. The first thing I'll do, select my car, GPU cache, export selection, and just give it a name. A quick note about the export selection for the pipeline cache. Since I'm exporting one node, it gave me a file path. If I'm exporting multiple nodes, like this for example, it will say which directory you want to add it in, because it will export each one of these nodes as a separate file. So if you're exporting one object, or you want it to be as one node, you should export from the top node, or export all. That will also put it as in one GPU cache node. If you have animation, it can track animation according to your timeline that you want to track it in. But since these are static files, I'm not really concerned about it. I want also to create a B-box out of this object. Maya 2013.5 will have convert to bounding box new functionality. You can either have it as one box or multiple per shape. So one bounding box per shape. You can also change the color. Combined resulting bounding box will put them all under one node. Here you go. So now this is my bounding box representation. I'm going to export it as a Maya file. Now I'm ready to assemble my definition. Create definition. By default, it will add a locator, and it will also tell you just make sure that you don't make any edits at this point. I'm going to add my scenes, just the cache. Remember, the B-box is a Maya file, so it goes under the category of a scene representation. And I can rename this to something I can easily remember. So let's examine our scene here. You can rearrange the representations by moving the active one up or down. The top level is always going to be the active. For example, let's save this scene. You see here the locator, because it's at the top level, is always active. I can add annotation. And you can flip representation via the active representation pull-down menu or from the screen. Or the outliner. If we examine the attribute editor, for example, for the Maya scene, it will have file location, so you can change that if you need to, and it will have name and label. So let's change the name for a second and make it something totally different. If I try to access it now, you will see it's still calling the file name, which means the change of representation via the UI is called by the label. So if I change the label to be something else, and I go to my representation, you'll see now that has changed. So what is the difference between label and name? The name will be used when you're scripting. So for example, if I have the command assembly, you can click by it and say help. It will give you the different flags that can be used. So I want to change, for example, my representation type, the assembly definition car, which is this one. And I want to change the name, be full. So let's change this to locator, for example, and run the script. And I got the error because I forgot to add another O. And here it is. So what I do usually as a best practice is to keep these names the same. This way I don't get confused. Either I'm calling it via the UI or the script. Go to my GPU. Might define this a little bit better because I'm having multiple types of cars coming in. Now I'm ready to create another definition. I can use the same existing one and call different files. So for example, I have the Suzuki car. I'm just going to call a different type of a car. Acura, for example. And for the B-box. Now I have different representations, but I need to rename them. Double check what I've done. I have my locator, it's calling for an Acura. My GPU cache is named Acura and it's calling the Acura file. This is my actual Acura file and my Acura B-box. And I changed the set definition name. I'm going to do save as. And that's the hardest part of the whole assembly situation, is you need to predefine your files, put them all in the same spot, and save them and just call them again in your definition nodes. As I said early in the beginning, this whole process can be easily automated, but I will leave that to you. It depends on your pipeline and how you're going to implement it. I'm going to create the same thing for all my assets, and my next step is to call them in an assembly reference, not to be confused with file reference. Once I finished all my car models, I just want to remind you of a couple of notes here. Any edits that will be done at this level will not be saved. For example, if I go to my locator or annotation and say, for example, display arrow, and I moved the text somewhere further than the original, and hit reload, you'll notice it came back, it bounced back to the original spot. If I go to one of the scenes and I modify the scene file itself, and I moved or changed transformation, reload the representation, and you see it bounced back in here. However, if I move the actual top node, which is the assembly definition, and change the representation, it will still hold its place because we edited or moved the top node, not the representation level. Also, I should remind you that once you change representation, you just erased your undo stack. There you go. You can't go back. So that's one quick note for you as well. So whenever you're working with assembly definition, all that you're doing in here is stacking your different types of representations, making sure they all at the same position that you want them to be. And whatever you're going to have at the top level, that's going to be your default save. I also like to grab your attention to the documentation under assembly definition. They are showing the same thing, that you'll have different types of representations. However, there are a couple of important notes here that you should be aware of. When you're doing assembly reference, which is something we're going to do right now, it's only called assembly definition. You can only bring one assembly definition at a time when you're referencing. So that means if you have multiple assembly definitions, for example, like this, and you're referencing file assembly reference, not file ref, it will only call the top node. So you should only have one assembly definition per file saved. Also, you cannot group or parent, which means if I reopen my file here and I have Maya scene and I try to group it, it's right there. But let's see if I go to my representation. See, it's not saved. Again, it also falls under the edits. You cannot change, you cannot edit anything at this level. The last thing is the Maya scene assembly is not accepted with file reference. So at this point, any type of file referencing does not work with scene assembly. The assembly reference node will act in a similar fashion as the assembly definition, where you have some sort of a switch that you can change to the different type of representation that was pre-called in the assembly definition. The major difference is that the assembly reference will track any type of change or transformation that you do at this level of hierarchy in an edit fashion, the same way that was the file reference edit acted, for example. You can look at the assembly definition as an asset that lives in your pipeline, and the assembly reference is an instance of that asset that will apply edits or changes to it according to whatever you want to do in your scene. So let's do an example. So I'm going to create an assembly reference node, and the first thing it will say, choose a file. It has to be an assembly definition file, otherwise it will not accept it. For example, let me get a none assembly definition, and you'll get an error saying assembly definition is not found. So make sure that you call an assembly definition file. Let's do this one more time, assembly reference. That's why I put a prefix for my files that has an AD in it. Makes it easier for me to find them. It's very similar to the assembly definition, and always the first representation will be the active one. So for example, I can change my representation type. Here's what I mean by edits. If I were to move the actual node that sits underneath the assembly reference node, for example, in here, remember, this is the assembly definition node, and I go to my GPU cache that's in here in the 00, go back to the file that I modified. See, it has moved to a new location because the edits are tracked in assembly. Now I see list edits, and you'll see that my node, which is my Maya file scene, has been translated to the following. I can remove the selected edits, and it will bounce back to the original place. So let's call another one. Let's call female 2, and this time, rather than calling female 1, I'm going to call female 2, and I'm going to move it a little bit further. So this assembly reference is calling assembly definition female 1. This assembly reference is calling assembly definition female 2. I can multi-select scene assembly female, and both of them will load the Maya scene. Now I transfer it to the GPU. Both of them are working correctly because I made sure that my naming convention is the same for all of them. So my label is called female GPU for all my scenes that contain female characters. So remember, the label is the one that's being called when I'm doing multi-select such as this. So I'm going to continue the same thing. And if you notice that changing the assembly reference node name, it will also reflect in the namespace. So that's one other thing that you should be aware of here. Making sure that these called the proper AD file. And if you notice wise, the object is disappearing because the top level is the locator. That's why it bounced down to the locator. Every time you change different representation, it's almost like an import functionality. So what I'm doing right now is I created a bunch of females. So this scene now contains 5 female characters in assembly reference type. I'm going to save this file. Now this file is saved as a regular Maya scene that contains assembly reference. I can do the following. File new, and I will call my pre-saved file as an assembly definition. And you'll see here it has the embedded hierarchy of the assembly references. And this is what we call assembly hierarchy. Assembly hierarchy or hierarchical assembly is a term we can use whenever we have an assembly definition embedded within assembly reference that is also embedded within assembly definition, and so on within the tree. A good example would be if we have a parking lot that is full of cars and we want to communicate with these cars as in one unit. So for example, I would start by creating my assembly definition of each car, and then I would create a new file that has multiple assembly reference for each type of car that I have. That in return will be my assembly definition file, Maya scene, that will be called as an assembly definition. I can also create a cache for it as one unit, and I'll also show you how to do that. And yet again, that file will be saved as an assembly definition that also can be called as assembly reference. I know this might be a little bit confusing to grasp at the first time, but if you actually follow me in this exercise and try to do it yourself, it will all make sense at the end. Here's the file that I previously created, which has the multiple female characters in my scene. So I'm just going to rename this to be assembly definition multiple females and save. I need to create another one for the males. And since this one is an assembly definition that is calling a file that we pre-saved, which I have already another file for the males, I'm just going to call the file and change my name. As you can see now, I called the proper file. It has all my males. Save as, and I'm going to save as a new assembly definition. Now I need to create my crowd scene, group of people crossing a street. So I will need the females and the males together in one file. So I'm going to do file new. One will be calling the females and one will be calling the males. Now my both assembly references are loading the assembly definition of each file, and by default we always pick the top, which in this case the locator. Since I have all my assemblies are named correctly, I can do multi-select and flip all of them in one shot rather than doing them one by one. All I'm going to do now is just place these characters so they will create some sort of a crowd crossing the street. I finished placing my characters. However, I thought I should mention that I was very careful what I'm moving. For example, after I expanded my assembly reference that is calling the definition file that has the multiple assembly reference of each character, when I moved them, I used the top node here, not this poly object. For one particular reason is that all the movement from now on, because these are fall under assembly reference node, anything that I'll do will be tracked in an edit. For example, the movement that I've done at this level, let's minimize this for a second, any movement I've done here will be tracked as the assembly reference edit. And you'll here see all the translations that I've done, translate X and Y and Z and rotate X and Y and Z for all these characters. For example, female one, which is this one. If I were to delete the selected edits, which is related to this one, you'll see it will bounce back to the original place. And if I would to change to GPU cache, the GPU cache is still in place. In other words, the character hierarchy did not change or was not altered. So again, I'm moving the character top node. So, but what if I select this character, which is the poly object that's underneath the assembly reference node, and I move it? Now, I go back to my assembly reference, list edit, let's get this here, and we want female 1. And you'll notice that it only has rotate. Remove selected edits. So it moved to a totally different position. So what's going on? You have to remember that this has an edit on. This object was altered or changed. So therefore, the edits will be saved in this level. So for example, I would select list edit, and you'll see here, remove it, and now bounced back. I need to bring it back to the original place. So I'm going to remove anything related to female 1. And here it is, bounce to that place again. Just put it in a new position. And again, remember, we're doing our change at the top level, so it will be easier for us to track. I'm just going to save my scene. Just call it crowd. One other note, I found a little problem in my scene, and I thought it would be a good exercise for troubleshooting. If I would select one of my characters at the bottom level, and just go to the manipulation tool. So this one is correct, this is in the center. So is this one? Ah, this one is not. So female 4 at the bottom level. You notice that the manipulator is not aligned with the object, which means the original object, the female 2 file, is not centrally pivot. So I'm just going to go to my original file, which is this one, and you'll see here's exactly the problem. The object is not center pivot. So define center pivot and save. So I saved my original file. Let's go back to the assembly reference node, which is this one. Reload it. Female 4, this one, and you see now when we select, it's centrally pivot correctly as we expected. So that was just a quick note that will be good for you to remember. When you try to troubleshoot something, you just need to track it down to the original. While we're on the topic of edits, I should also point out how can we use the edits to alter the display of our characters. For example, I'll be using the same characters for other areas of my scene, so I want to give them a little bit of a change or a difference in color. So I can, for example, go to the attribute editor of the material, and I know this character, I already made a variation of that dress. I'm just going to change it, and now she's wearing a red dress. If I go to the female, this is female 1, list edits for that. You'll notice that the edits are saved for that particular character that I changed the body color or the texture that is assigned to that shader. We'll do it one more time here. And I also done it for a couple of other male characters. Now let's have a quick look at the edits. I'll go to the node that I want to list the edits for. So for example, I'm just selecting the top node, which is the females AR, and I'll say list edits. And this edit window, as you see here, it's reflecting the female AR. If I were to select the males AR, this window is still showing that I'm opening the females AR. So you want to make sure that you are working with the proper window. So this is the males and this is the females. Going back here, and I will say show affecting selected, which means show me the edits that are affecting the top nodes of the changes. So meaning that all the translation that I've done will be showed up in here. However, if I say let's edit stored on selected, that will give me also the embedded changes that I've done. There's the textures, because the texture is stored on the object level, not at the AD node level. I hope that makes sense. One more time, if we go to the males, for example, scene assembly, list edits, and show on selection, that will give me the changes or the edits that I've done at this top level, the one that's right underneath the top node hierarchy. However, if I say list edit sorted on selected, it will give me everything within the hierarchy. So if anything underneath it, it will show up, and so on and so forth. Now if I were to save my scene, file new, reload it again, see what's happening. It opened the scene, applied the edits according to the changes that we've done, and you'll have everything as you saved it before. So the edits are tracked and saved. If I would to go, for example, and I would say make this GPU cache and make the males locators, save, you will see the changes that you made in the representation will be saved, and it will be applied accordingly whenever you open your object again. Right, so save it. Assembly edits are very similar to file reference edits. Matter of fact, it's based upon the file reference edits. However, they're not entirely the same, as not everything is currently supported. For now, we have set adder, add and delete adder, connect and disconnect, and I put an asterisk here to say not everything in connect and disconnect is currently supported. If we have a hierarchy such as this, assembly reference calling assembly definition, and return this definition has 3 assembly reference in them saved in it. Each one of them has its own assembly definition, which also have its own multiple representations. If I make a change at this level, it will affect this assembly reference, and it will appear at this level as well. If I make the change in here, it will affect this node at this level, and it will appear in here. If I make the change in here, it will appear and affect here, as this is the one that's right above it. So in short, all the connections that you make or the edits that you make will appear at the level that's right above it, and it always appear at the assembly reference. Edit contents, which is at this level, not 100% supported, so we can make few changes, but not everything will work. For example, changing color, textures, transformation, that kind of stuff will work. However, everything you do at this level, at the assembly definition level here, is currently supported, meaning anything you do at this level will appear, and it is currently supported, and it will work at this assembly reference level. Going back to Maya, let's apply some of the things we've learned about the edits. We can have multiple windows of edits. So this is for the multi-female AR. This is for the multi-male AR. Since this is an AR node, you can have a window for it as well. So even though that they are in the same hierarchy, you can have different windows for each AR node. Let's say, for example, we're working with the males. We get this character and see what kind of edits we have on it. Is it nothing? So let's flip to the B box, and I will go at the bottom level or the representation level, and I make an edit for it. So now if I go here, I will see there are some edits done at that particular level. What if I flip now this B box to a male? So I changed the representation. This edit should fail. Now it's red, because what it's looking for is trying to find the label that's called B box here, which is this one. And it's not there anymore. Therefore, it will fail the edit that we've done, printing it in red. If I flip it back to the B box, refresh, now it's in white, indicating that the edits are going to be applied. If I flip it to none, sorry, this one to none, refresh, and it will say this is an applied edit. So that's the difference between an applied edit, failed edit. Just gonna reopen my file again. Now I'm gonna get my GPU cache for this crowd at this position. So I'm just gonna go GPU cache, and this time I'm gonna use export all. By doing that, I'm gonna put all the nodes in one file. File new. I'm going to create an assembly definition that will call my cache, and I will call my scene that I just saved. The first thing you notice what happened to all my characters. Let's show them. They lost the position that they were in. And this will be a good reminder that edits don't show up at the assembly definition level. So all I'm going to do, I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to save it. And if I do file new, assembly reference, you notice now the position that we have previously saved in the edit will come out nicely in here. And this is exactly what we've done previously, but now everything is saved under the assembly reference node at the top hierarchy. For the next few minutes, I'm going to take the job of the layout artist. I'm going to start assembling my scene via the predefined assembly definition files that I already pre-saved. Now I'm done with my scene setup. I have all geometries as a GPU cache, therefore I have about 15 or 20 frames per second. If I would change the representation to something else like my scene file, the frames speed will drop according to your amount of information that will be displayed. For example, I dropped from 19 to 10. At the end, I hope you guys enjoy this session, and I'm looking forward to talk to you more.